Professor Claudia Sadowski-Smith, Professor of English and American Studies at Arizona State University, and she's going to talk about her new book, The New Immigrant Whiteness, Neoliberalism, Race, and Post-Soviet Migration to the United States.
This book is trying to do lots of different things, but I narrowed it down to a few for today. It is looking at how members of the post-Soviet diaspora, and by that I mean folks who came here from the former Soviet Union or post-Soviet nations in the late 1980s and then specifically in the 90s, so since the late 1980s. So how members of this diaspora are collectively racialized in narratives of U.S. whiteness, and I'll explain this a little bit, which has emerged, these narratives have emerged from scholarship specifically by historians on turn of the 20th century European immigrants, specifically Irish immigrants, Southern and Eastern European immigrants. And these narratives highlight a connection between upward mobility, upward social and economic mobility, and also racial assimilation to whiteness. But then how the ethnic and especially legal diversity, and that's what the book really focuses on. By that I mean the legal status, the diversity of legal status with which members of this post-diaspora actually arrive, complicates this narrative, and as well as the emphasis on collective characteristics that we find in migration studies. When migration studies look at a group of people, they usually try to think about collective characteristics that make that group particularly liable to either assimilate or create transnational connections. Another idea that I look at is how this idea of U.S. whiteness that has emerged from the turn of the 20th century immigration is becoming globalized. And I look at this with regards to family migration, particularly adoptive and marriage migration. Marriage migration, by that I mean something that's very often pejoratively called mail order bride migration, right? And finally, this book also looks at how post-Soviet immigrants actually relate to other contemporary immigrants in the United States, particularly those racialized as non-white, who make up the majority of immigrants who come to this country today. And I'm looking at the attitudes of post-Soviet diaspora, members of the post-Soviet diaspora toward anti-immigration legislation. I'm a literary scholar, but when I did this project, I realized very early on that I had to do a lot of interdisciplinary research. and one of the things I had to do is I had to look at demographic statistics. And I had help, so you can trust me on these things. So I actually asked some people that know what they're doing. But I realized that there's very little information about this particular group of folks. The most recent American community survey, and I can explain if you guys have questions later how that's different from the census and why, but anyway, this group is, so folks who identify themselves as having been born in the former Soviet Union or post-Soviet nations make up the 8th largest immigrant group in the United States. So that's pretty significant, and yet they are much less studied than immigrants from South Korea or the Dominican Republic, who are smaller. And I say this because when I do this work and talk to folks who are not interested in this area of the world, they always ask me, why are you doing this? You know, this group is like not significant, right, numerically, so it's not really important work, right? So that's why I'm crunching numbers, otherwise I wouldn't really care. And in Arizona, which is important because I'm going to talk about post-Soviet immigrants in Arizona and their attitudes toward anti-immigration legislation at the end of my talk, we have a very steep trajectory, steep growth of post-Soviet immigrants. In the absence of earlier immigration, there's very little earlier waves of immigration from historical predecessors, geographical predecessors for the Soviet Union or the Soviet Union. Okay, so this is really the predominant immigration that we've had to Arizona. And you guys know Arizona is very close to Mexico, so they're exposed, in other words, to different racial formations, although in New York City you have obviously many of the same issues, or I guess in the whole country right now. But in Arizona, those issues are in the forefront all the time of debate. What I found very interesting is that the national diversity, and I don't have to explain to you guys what I mean by that, or ethnic diversity, but we can talk about it a little bit later. This group is actually, the group is becoming more diverse. Where initially we had most people coming here from Russia, and now and Ukraine, those people from those two post-Soviet nations make up about 60% of the diaspora, whereas 8 other nations make up between 2 and 5%. So there's a lot of diversity, and as you already know, not everybody in the diaspora is racialized as white. right? Or themselves thinks as being racialized as white. But what I found the most interesting and why I structured the book the way I did is that there's also increasing legal diversity, which makes perfect sense if you think about how our immigration system works. But one of the arguments I was trying to make in the book, and my friends in migration studies didn't really like it, so I toned it down. But my hypothesis still is that actually members of this diaspora are the most diverse group in terms of how they come here legally, because they participate in all forms of available migration to this country in very significant numbers, in ways that is just not typical of other immigrant groups. So other immigrant groups tend to dominate one particular form of migration. And that's how migration studies also works, that they look at one form of migration. For example, marriage migration, they look at Filipinas. Adoption, they look at people from China and Korea, right? And actually, the post-Soviet diaspora, members of the diaspora, cut across all of those categories, including undocumented migration as well, which I can talk about. I don't get to talk about very much today. I'll talk about it in your class. So while at the beginning of the diaspora in the late 1980s, and of course already in the 1970s, where some people were allowed to come, Jewish refugees dominated this diaspora. By the end of the decade, that was no longer the case. And actually, marriage migrants and adoptive migrants made up the second largest group after, in the case of marriage migrants, after Filipinas, in the case of adoptive migrants, after Chinese adoptees. Okay? So that is significant when we think about how this group has been looked at all, right? So there's actually generally very little scholarship, and the scholarship that's there looks at particular parts of this diaspora. So not surprisingly, Jewish studies have focused on the Jewish migration in this diaspora. Then there's some scholarship on sex workers and marriage migrants, which is actually focuses on them being victims of trafficking, and it's very different from the ways in which sex workers and migrants, marriage migrants from the global south are portrayed in terms of an emphasis on neoliberalism and how they are in structures of neoliberalism in which they get caught, so to speak. The scholarship on adoption from Russia and Ukraine primarily focuses on health adversities that you're probably familiar with, diseases such as fetal alcohol syndrome and reactive attachment disorder. In literary studies, we have a focus on the literature that's been produced by, it's actually a growing body of literature produced by members of this diaspora, and its connections to either Russian literature or to a diasporic perspectives, particularly literature in Israel. There is some work on German post-Soviet literature as well, but it's actually not fleshed out. There's a huge body of that kind of literature emerging there as well. And then, as I said, migration studies really try to focus on collective characteristics on arrival. So the idea would be to say the adaptation of immigrants is pretty much shaped by their education or their skill level, which in the case of this particular diaspora, collectively is higher than most other contemporary immigrant groups, and also is more equal across gender. And then the second focus that they would look at is a collective racialization in the United States. But there's very little emphasis, interesting enough, on the emphasis of the importance of legal status on arrival, except for the recognition that there's difference between undocumented arrival and documented arrival, right? So legal and undocumented. But that there are actual different categories and that they determine how people adapt to the United States and how they create transnational identities. There's very little work on that. And that's kind of what this book is trying to contribute to. So in the first part of the book, I'm looking at how post-Soviet immigrants are actually racialized collectively in the United States. And I was trying to find some representations of that. There are not a lot of representations, as you probably know, so I ended up with reality TV, and I'm going to talk about this in just a second. And so what I found is that the racialization of post-Soviet migrants functions through this comparison to turn of the 20th century European immigrants, as I mentioned earlier, and particularly the idealized narratives we associate with their upward mobility and their assimilation to whiteness after World War I, or starting in the 1940s. And secondly, and I think this was really surprising to me, it happens to a contrast, explicit contrast to contemporary immigrants who are racialized as non-white, mainly those racialized as Latino. So the idea is while turn of the century, 20th century European immigrants were racialized as white in contrast to African Americans, at the time the largest non-white population, now the focus is on Latinos. And this is really, basically what is happening is that these narratives are influenced by whiteness studies, which was created, a form of it was created by immigration scholars, and by looking at this particular turn of the 20th century European immigrants, and thinking through how they were both white on arrival because they were able to naturalize right away because of naturalization laws that emphasized whiteness, right? So only those who were white were able to naturalize. They were excluded from largely excluded from state-sponsored violence, right? And they had, that was directed toward other groups such as African Americans. And in the Southwest, Mexican and Mexican Americans, for example, they had access to better jobs than African Americans and Chinese. At the same time, they were not quite white. And one of the examples is, for example, that there were some Italian lynchings. There were very few, but there were some. That there were discrimination in the labor market. As you know, they were making less money than native-born whites, exclusion from elite society, but also, most importantly, the 1920s Quota Acts that you probably remember were based on eugenic racial theories at the time, making members of the Southern and Eastern European races, or thinking that they were inferior than other Europeans. So the emphasis of this scholarship is on trying to see how these immigrants were trying to become white, completely white, accessing all facets of whiteness by actually embracing white supremacy, okay? Including state-sponsored violence and exclusion. So the example that is most often talked about is the support of Irish immigrants for Chinese exclusion in 1882, but there are also the participation of Irish in the Mexican-American War, and then specifically with regards to Italian and some Jewish immigrants, their attempts to exclude African Americans from neighborhoods as they were trying to move into those neighborhoods. And the narrative that has, and the idea that has come out of studying these groups is also that they were able to access upward mobility especially after World War II, and especially the descendants of immigrants, right? By acquiring educational and workplace skills, and by disproportionately benefiting from the expanded social welfare state that emerged after World War II. So for example, European immigrants were the greatest beneficiaries of FHA loans, had higher rates of home ownership than native-born populations by 1940, and were more likely than even native-born whites to work in occupations covered by Social Security and nearing retirement when the program was instituted. So these are the narratives that are very prevalent in immigration scholarship and ethnic studies scholarship, and that are really the only ones we have right now to think about immigrants who are racialized predominantly as white in this country. So in the absence of other narratives, these are the ones that are being applied to this new migration that's come since the 1980s. So I'm going to give you two examples. The representation of Russians, but of Russians who don't necessarily live here, who are definitely not immigrants, who are just kind of happen to find themselves on the East Coast and doing something, usually bad things, right? In these shows, particularly, really trying to highlight their status as villains and terrorists. There's some interesting work on how they are very often used as stand-ins for folks coming from the Middle East, right? And actually the representation of Russians, right? It's more complicated, but I'm just going to say that. As terrorists has actually increased, there are actually more instances of Russians being portrayed as terrorists than folks supposedly coming from the Middle East, right? So I was trying to look at is new representations that actually focus specifically on this new immigrant groups as immigrants. So one of those is Russian doll. So there was a lot of pushback in the community against this. It was a reality TV show. So I have theories why reality TV is the place where those folks are most often represented that we can talk about. But it's just a one-season show. It got canceled after 12 episodes. And to me, the interesting thing about this show was that the co-creators, who are themselves post-Soviet immigrants and came here as 1.5 generation immigrants. By that I mean folks who came as children, right, different ages. They created the show and they pitched it as a version of Jersey Shore. Jersey Shore is was actually the first show, reality TV show, that focused only on members of the supposed same ethnicity, Italian Americans. They actually, most of the folks on there are not Italian Americans, but that's the idea, right? So they're Italian Americans. They are supposedly they're supposedly representing a culture, a collective ethnicized white culture that has grown out of this Southern European immigration I was talking about earlier at the turn of the 20th century, and these are the descendants supposedly, right? Because Italian Americans were actually the ones that their upward mobility was actually the slowest, right? So we've had remnants of this sort of culture of folks who are actually not upwardly mobile, right? And who represent themselves in this type of ethnicized identity, sometimes also called Guido culture, which revolves around especially body enhancement and partying, right? So going to tanning salons, partying, bodybuilding, and so on and so forth, as we see here. So the idea is that at least by engaging in that kind of behavior, this group can show that they're trying to. It's a way to be upwardly mobile through consumerism, basically, right? Where in fact the group is not as upwardly mobile as it is being portrayed. These 1.5 generation immigrant creators of Russian dolls specifically thought of this show as something that would follow Jersey Shore, and you can see this in the casting call that they issued. So they were looking at people that would fulfill the same kind of stereotypes as so the fun-loving Russians, right, that would drink vodka and would basically follow the Russian Snoopy or the situation those were cast members on Jersey Shore. So the idea was to show how this group of people, and they were focusing on 1.5 immigration cast members, were creating a Russian collective identity, even though the majority of them were actually Ukrainian or Belarus Jewish immigrants. That was very similar to Italian and Italian American ethnicized whiteness, right? The show completely, even though there were signs that most of the cast members were Jewish, the show really completely ignored that and focused on the Russianness of these folks. And they referred to themselves as Russian, to the point that there had to be hostility toward groups racialized as non-white. There was one entire episode, 120-minute episode, focused on the blondest of these women who had a Spanish boyfriend. They never actually said, what exactly his ethnic identity was. And she was told by her parents and herself realized that she had to break up with this boyfriend because he was not Russian. Dancing with the Stars, which has started up again. Is anybody watching it? Are you guys familiar with the show? So I got really interested in the show for lots of different reasons, but I realized that there's a huge number of cast members who are from the former Soviet Union, the majority of them being 1.5 generation cast members. There's a reason for that, because this show is an adaptation of a British show, and it features the British form of ballroom dancing, international ballroom dancing, rather than American ballroom dancing. And so they needed to actually hire people that know what they're doing. Most of these people were trained in the former USSR, were themselves involved in dance sport. And so they're on the show to train these B-listed celebrities, and they're supposed to learn ballroom dancing, right? And then they're supposed to showcase it. A lot of these folks have become regulars on the show, though, so they have actually a fan following, and so the show has to talk about them and give them some space to explain why they're there. And so first of all, they're identified as immigrants, even though the show has folks from Australia on there as well and from other countries, but those folks are not identified as immigrants. They're identified as immigrants within these narratives of earlier European immigration. So they've come as part of family migration with their families. It is never said that they were actually probably Jewish or arrived as Jewish refugees, but that's implied because they have the whole entire families that they sometimes show, including the grandmother and so on and so forth. And within this family migration, the parents get to talk about why they brought their children here, and the reason is to give them a better life, right, than what they were able to have in the former Soviet Union or post-Soviet nations. But there's no other concrete evidence here. And the idea is they came here, they left behind their old life and their old countries, they severed all their connections and want to assimilate to U.S. culture and society in very similar ways as early immigrants. And also that they're upwardly mobile through, first of all, participation in dance sport, the creation of these ballroom studios that have mushroomed, right, in the country because of this migration. It was not the case before, and also their participation in the show. Right, reality TV, the idea always is if you participate as a cast member, you're going to be upwardly mobile, right, because you're going to get well known and, you know, have a following and so on and so forth. They're very often paired with B-list African American and Latino celebrities, and the show never has, so far, over all these seasons, there have never been any conflicts between these the ballroom dancers and the cast members. And remember, reality TV thrives on conflict. So if there had been conflict that was racialized or racial, they would have shown it. It hasn't been there. But what actually happened in the absence of that, because again, we need to have whiteness has to be racialized in distinction to non-whiteness, right? So dance scholarship that's been looking at the presence of post-Soviet dancers in U.S. dance sport, the dominance actually of this dance sport by post-Soviet dancers has already thought about their participation in this dance sport, or their domination, in terms that are very similar to the idea in which, the way in which turn of the 20th century European immigrants were racialized. So one of the forms in which that happened was blackface, right? So particularly Irish and Jewish performers at the turn of the 20th century were dominating that particular cultural form. And the idea, the way in which that is read by whiteness historians, is to say that they were Irish and Jewish performers were donning blackface in order to differentiate themselves actually from other, from African Americans, and appealing to the mainly white native-born audience, to appealing to the sameness, the racial sameness. Similarly, dance sport scholars have talked about how post-Soviet ballroom dancers are actually using spray tanning, which is very essential to the sport, just like it is in bodybuilding, for example, in order to set themselves apart, to wear brown face and set themselves apart from the majority of immigrants today that are racialized as brown or Latino, because they're the ones who are the object of attack mainly, right, in anti-immigration discourse and legislation. These new immigrants need to reinforce their whiteness similarly to earlier ones by setting themselves apart from and also emerging in acts of hostility toward those racialized as non-white.